So we're just going to do the first link right now, and the questions that go along with these are A, to people living in the Middle Ages, what was the only way to get into heaven? B, how might fear allow the church to control the people and their lives? C, what are ways that peasants might try to please and satisfy the church to stay in its good graces? D, how did the church make money, and what might we look toward to see its wealth in action? So here we go, the medieval church. The medieval church played a far greater role in medieval England than the church does today. In medieval England, the church dominated everybody's life. All medieval people, be the village peasants or town people, believed that God, heaven, and hell all existed. From the very earliest of ages, the people were taught that the only way they can get into heaven was if the Roman Catholic Church let them. Everybody would have been terrified of hell, and the people would have been told of the sheer horrors awaiting for them in hell in the weekly services they attended. The control the church had over the people was total. Peasants worked for free on church land. This proved difficult for peasants, as the time they spent working on the church land could have been better spent working on their own plots of land producing food for their families. They paid 10% of what they earned in a year to the church. This tax was called tithes. Tithes could be paid in either money or in goods produced by peasant farmers. As peasants had little money, they almost always had to pay in seeds, harvested grain, animals, etc. This usually caused a peasant a lot of hardship, as seeds, for example, would be needed to feed a family the following year. What the church got in tithes was kept in huge tithe barns. A lot of the stored grain would have been eaten by rats or poisoned by their urine. A failure to pay tithes, so the peasants were told by the church, would lead to their souls going to hell after they had died. This picture says, now a museum, this building was once a tithe barn serving Maidstone, Kent. This is one reason why the church was so wealthy. One of the reasons Henry VIII wanted to reform the church was to get hold of the Catholic Church's money. People were too scared not to pay tithes, despite the difficulties it meant for them. You also had to pay for baptisms. If you were not baptized, you could not go to heaven when you died. Marriages. There were no couples living together in medieval times, as the church taught that this equaled sin. And burials. You had to be buried on holy land if your soul was going to go to heaven. Whichever way you looked, the church received money. This picture says Archbishop's Palace in Maidstone, Kent. The church also did not have to pay taxes. This saved them a vast sum of money and made it far more wealthy than any of the King of England at this time. The sheer wealth of the church is best shown in its buildings, cathedrals, churches, and monasteries. In medieval England, peasants lived in crook houses. These were filthy, usually no more than 2 rooms, with a wooden frame covered with wattle and daub, a mixture of mud, straw, and manure. No crook houses exist now. Most simply collapsed after a while as they were so poorly built. However, there are many medieval churches around. The way they were built and have lasted for centuries is an indication of how well they were built and the money the church had to invest in these buildings. This says, this church in Rottingdean, East Sussex, is nearly 1,000 years old. It was made of stone and built to last. It would have been much larger than a medieval peasant's crook house. Important cities would have cathedrals in them. The most famous cathedrals were at Canterbury and York. After the death of Thomas Becket, Canterbury Cathedral became a center for pilgrimage, and the city grew more and more wealthy. So did the church. Cathedrals were vast. They are big by our standards today, but in medieval England, they were bigger than all buildings, including royal palaces. Their sheer size meant that people would see them from miles around, and reminds them of the huge power of the Catholic Church in medieval England. This says, this entrance to Amiens Cathedral in France shows just how vast cathedrals were. The doors alone are over 20 feet tall, while the porch, which surrounds it, makes this doorway nearly 60 feet tall, taller than many houses now. To work on the buildings of a cathedral was a great honor. Those who did the skilled work had to belong to a guild. They would have used just the most basic of tools and less than strong scaffolding to do the ceilings. However, if you were killed in an accident while working in a cathedral or a church, you were guaranteed a place in heaven, or so the workers were told.